Conviction is brought to you by Three Rings Circus Productions. For links to our valued sponsors and all the show notes from this podcast, please visit our website, threeringscircus.com.au. Episode 11. Last episode, we left Craig as he completed his 1,000-kilometre ocean paddle to raise money to support the research into children's cancer. Exhausted but satisfied, it was time for Craig to return to Sydney and reunite with Project Gymea. This elite team of covert surveillance specialists were about to begin another assignment.
So all things come to an end, I suppose, as they say, and it was time to get back to work. I just spent all my annual leave, well, not all my annual leave, but the majority of it doing this paddle, and I was pretty shattered, I must admit. Lisa and I and the kids had moved house. I'd gone from our old place we'd built, sold that successfully, and moved into this nice new big house with a pool. It had white ants in there, and I didn't realise they were so active, and we virtually had to gutter some of the house and start to put white ant baits and everything else around. Completely stripped the pool, a beautiful big 12.5 metre pool, repaved it and redid part of the house. So things were happening at home as well as at work. Again, Jessica was still going back for their regular checkups, and so far so good. Her hair was getting longer again, and she'd moved into year 4 at school, was powering at school. The other two kids, Tim and Kyles, were growing up, and Tim at school and Kyles was at kindy. So everything was going really well. Life was normal.
This was the first time in many months that Craig could consider home life to be normal, to be stable. He was refreshed, rejuvenated, and ready to throw himself into work without any distractions.
Work was just about to get crazy. The Crimes Commissioner had called us in, and we were just about to start on some new targets. Targets that I hadn't worked on before. I'd heard of some of them, but I had never met them or done any work on them. They were quite big targets. Back in the early days, I suppose, we're going back to the 80s, 90s. There was one particular major figure, Arthur Neddy Smith.
Arthur Neddy Smith was one of the most infamous crime figures in Australian history. He was convicted of drug trafficking, theft, rape, armed robbery and murder. He died in jail in September 2021 and is still the #1 suspect in multiple unsolved murders. In the late 70s and 80s, he was a mentor, a godfather if you like, to many of Australia's emerging crime bosses. Flash forward 20 years later, and Craig and Project Gymea are about to target 2 of his disciples.
Our next targets were sort of related to Arthur Neddy Smith, or Neddy as he's known. And one of the targets is a bloke by the name of Glen Flack.
Target number 1, Glen Flack.
Glen Flack was there present drinking on one particular day over in Coogee with Smith. And after a big drinking session, I think it was 1987, both Smith and Flack got into a car and drove off from Coogee, and as they were heading off they had an incident with a tow truck driver, a bloke by the name of Ronald Flaffel. Neddy's got out with Flack, and an altercation broke loose and Flaffel got stabbed and died. We had Smith charged, but funnily enough, the police station that held the brief was broken into and everything went missing.
Target number 2, Richard Harry Harris.
It was back in a few years later, I think it was 1988. Smith had actually lost his contact with Rogerson and was still out doing bits and pieces. And him, Flack, and another guy by the name of Richard Harry Harris teamed up to do an armed robbery at the Botany Council over in South Sydney. And they had learnt that around the Christmas time in '88, there was a massive payroll that was being delivered to pay all the council workers, and they had planned to do an armed robbery. Somehow they were put in, and they were caught in the act and arrested at the scene with their shotguns, balaclavas, everything else, and arrested by the armed hold-up unit. And all of them were arrested. So Smith, Flack and Harris all put in jail and let loose. So we learned a little bit about Flack's history, and obviously he'd been around for a long time, and he was released in the early 90s from the armed robbery charge, and so was Richard Harris. Richard Harris was pretty much known as Harry. Everyone called him Harry Harris, and that's what we called him, Harry, when we mentioned him in briefings and things like that. He was English. He'd come out from England. He was a strength and conditioning trainer, apparently, with the South Sydney Rabbitohs.
The South Sydney Rabbitohs are a foundation club of the New South Wales Rugby League, and today they play in the expanded National Rugby League. The NRL, as it's now known, is a highly professional and regulated sporting organisation. However, rugby league clubs in the 70s and 80s had many associates with colourful backgrounds.
Flack, his employment was unknown. He drove a Mercedes. He lived on the Central Coast with his family. He had a wife and kids up there, and then during the week he also resided down in the city in a unit. And pretty much that was all given. Just a bit of background on those. Harris had from memory, it was a red ute, so it stood out a bit. We did the normal stuff when we started the investigation. We're checking out their addresses, see where their cars were parked, see what their normal behaviour was. We didn't do too much of a follow. We're still waiting to get telephone intercepts. And during the briefing before, the Crimes Commissioner said Flack was pretty much known at that time as Mr Untouchable, because the NCA had worked on him for a number of years and still couldn't put anything on him. You know, they knew what he was up to, or they believed they knew what he was up to with the drugs, and they certainly found some money. But they hadn't been able to nail him down to anything else, and that was it. So it was going to be interesting, and we thought it was going to be hard.
Craig and the team did the usual background work in mapping out everything associated with their targets: car registrations, leased premises, work locations, everything down to gym memberships, but most importantly, phone numbers and the implementation of telephone intercepts.
So it was good just to get back out on the road again. I always loved being out on the road and to follow these guys around. And once the telephone intercepts started, there wasn't a lot of chatter about drugs or anything like that. They talked more about where they'd meet and what they'd do and training. Flack was into his fitness as well, and they'd do a fair bit of running and swimming down along the beaches of the eastern suburbs. It wasn't until a point, I suppose, where we got a telephone intercept to say that Flack wanted to meet up with Harris.
This was a significant development, as it indicated the two targets had something brewing.
So we learned about this first meeting, and it was going to be over at Ultimo. They didn't say exactly where it was, but it was going to be near the Ultimo, one of the pubs there in Ultimo. And I'd done a bit of a recce before I was going to start over there doing surveillance. I hadn't really seen these guys too much because we just sort of had a look at their places and their cars where they were parked, and I'd seen them from a distance. First time I saw him was they had the meeting off Harris Street in Ultimo. We all stayed a safe distance away. I'd driven by and I'd actually seen what they sort of looked like. Flack was just a middle-aged, I'd say he would have been in his 40s at that stage. Average build. Yeah, wouldn't say he was fit, wouldn't say he was unfit. Clean cut, business attire. Harris on the other side was completely different. Mate, he was massive. He was a big man. He was a strength and conditioning coach. I believe he loved a bit of boxing, but he was a massive unit. He would have been 6'4". I reckon he would have been about 115 to 120 kilos of muscle bulk. Always, sort of in tracksuit, loved a bum bag around his waist. Massive upper frame, so he wore, quite a tight shirt. I don't know if you can get a normal shirt to fit him. Dark hair and runners on, and he, as I said, he drove this red ute. So the first meeting they had, we let them just have a chat. We didn't even see whether anything was exchanged. At the end of the meeting, we decided to follow Harris, and he went back to Drummoyne. So he drove over the Anzac Bridge, went right up through Drummoyne, and he went into a small street off the main drag, and then made another right-hand turn. And we sort of lost him in Tremere Street because we were trying to stay a safe distance away. No one saw him leave at the other end of the street, so we knew he was somewhere in there, and we just sat back, and then probably about 10 minutes later we saw him come out from that street. We didn't know which house he'd been in. The street was probably about 400 metres long, a mixture of houses, unit blocks, had a church, just a general suburbia street. So we just noted that, and I mean, we couldn't do a search on all those premises there to try and find out where he went, but it certainly went in the memory bank.
Meticulous planning was always the starting point in these investigations. However, sometimes a hunch, a gut feeling, would provide a breakthrough.
At the completion of that day, I thought about that Tremere Street, and I wanted to go back and have a look. It did have interest to me. He'd gone there for a reason. He'd just spoken to Flack, and I thought, he's gone there, whether he'd been past something or whether he had to give someone a note, or I don't know, something triggered me. So I went back there on the way home. It was sort of a round away to get home, but I went that way. Drove into Tremere Street and parked at one end and walked up the other, just had a look at all the premises, and I noticed that it sort of went from a low to a high side with a bit of a gradient in the middle. There was tree lines all the way along, and I thought, okay, I'll put some gear in the car just in case we come back here. If there is another meeting, I've got an idea that I could use this area in the middle to do a bit of surveillance, and maybe I wouldn't do the follow, I'll stay there. And sure enough, the next day there was a telephone intercept to say, from Flack, meet me in the same spot as yesterday. And I just said, to our team leader, I might go over to Tremere Street and stay there and see if he comes this way. Tell the others to stay back, and I'll just see what happens. So I went into Tremere Street as their meeting. There was a Flack and Harris meeting. The main thing again, the crew sort of stayed away at the time. Sure enough, they followed Harris out of there, and he headed back over towards Drummoyne, and once they crossed over, within about half a kilometre of where I was, they peeled off, and sure enough he came in. I was lucky enough, I was in a really good spot. I'd been home that afternoon, and I grabbed my chainsaw and a bag, some ropes, and I parked my ute. I had the back off. I had an esky, I had a video camera in my esky. I had it sitting on the back of the tray, and I sort of put myself up a little tree on the limb with my chainsaw sort of hanging down, and I had my radio with me, and I just said to the others, yeah, he's coming up Tremere Street now, and just lay off and I'll see where he goes. And luckily for me, he stopped about 2 houses away, which is a unit block, and I was up this tree and he had no idea. He didn't look, so I sort of fit the part. It was just like working in the street. I watched him go into a garage of a unit block, and I noticed there was probably about 6 garages facing me. He parked his ute, red ute, right outside the garage door. He had a good look up and down the driveway to make sure no one was looking. He didn't see me at all. As soon as he opened the garage door, he sort of jumped under and closed it behind him. These garage doors ran along, as I said, there was about 6 of them, and above each garage was a window. The garage that he went out, the window had been removed and had been replaced with a dark fixed panel, so you couldn't look in. And again, that sort of sent a trigger as well. He was in there for a short time, came out, and then left again, similar to what he'd done before. So all of a sudden we had a garage that didn't belong to either of these guys, and when we searched it, the actual unit was leased by one of the mates of Flack, who was well known, and it was leased out to his partner. So the next question was, what was in there? Why was he coming here? And of course the normal thing was that we had to apply for another covert search warrant.
A covert search warrant can involve the entering of the target premises and or adjoining premises without notifying the occupiers. An officer can impersonate someone else whilst executing a covert search, and they can do anything reasonable to conceal that the search has taken place. It is also permitted to take place at night.
We were granted the warrant, and again, with the covert warrant, we can get in there without informing anyone. It had to be done at night, and that was our next aim that night. We had to do it straight away. Everything was done in a sequence. We had to make sure we knew straight away before things disappeared or changed. So at 1 a.m. we had a briefing, and the briefing was to obviously secure the area. We had to make sure that both Flack and Harris were home. They weren't going to come out to the garage. We had to make sure that the occupier of the unit wasn't going to come down and disturb us. The unit was pretty much above where the garage was, so we had to be super, super quiet. We had to make sure that even if anyone else came in, that we weren't disturbed. We had an entry team go in. Entry team consisted usually of 2 of our personnel and with another entry team from a different area. And it's always exciting these times, you know, your heart's beating. You're virtually breaking into places where you could be caught out pretty easy. And that was the case, obviously, with us. We knew that obviously there was going to be something in here. There was definitely going to be something in this garage. It's just a matter of what it was. So in we went. I think it was 2 a.m. entry. And when you're working on these things, it just seems to take forever. You know, I'm pacing up and down, calling whether there's a car or whether there's people. Everything's whispered through the radios because you're being as quiet as you can. Here you are, you've got residents just above the unit garage that you're going into to have a view, and when you've got an entry team in there, you're also wanting to know what's in there yourself. You know, you wish you were on the insides, even though it's a bit more dangerous on the inside doing these jobs, but on the outside you're just waiting to hear the news, and nothing's said on the radio. The only next thing we hear is, you know, whether they're out or they've got troubles. But we knew they were in. They'd already called they're in, and we're waiting. And the time just seems to go on and on and on. They would have been in there for a good hour and a half. So it tells us something on the outside that, okay, there's something there and there's something there that's worthwhile. The next call we get is everyone back to the commission. They're out, the team's out, everything's secure. And we're getting back to the commission, you know, it's 4 a.m. in the morning. Even though it's 4 a.m. in the morning, you've been working the day before, you're not tired because your adrenaline is pumping. The guys who had been in, they're not going to tell us what's there, but I could see by the smiles of their face that there's something big.
In the next episode of Conviction, we discover what was hidden in the garage as the investigation into Flack and Harris intensifies. Craig steps up for a special award amongst some devastating family news. Conviction, the Craig Gouzet story, is a podcast based on Craig's personal recollections. It is not a full and complete representation of the cases, the people, or the investigations, and therefore should not be taken as such. This podcast is based on Craig's memories. Craig and Three Ring Circus have taken care not to disclose surveillance methods that would compromise police procedures. Only real names have been used where we have permission or the records are public domain.